Welcome to The Forest for the Trees. I'm Ross Hunsinger. When things are dark and hard to decipher, it helps to have illumination. It is without question that our guest today is one of the most respected and consistent sources of light in the industry. Dr. Ethan Russo is a board-certified neurologist, the current medical director at Phytex, the former senior medical advisor to GW Pharmaceuticals, a widely published author and contributor to a number of books and scholarly works. Dr. Russo is a true lighthouse in dark seas and has given us all a great deal of valuable information, for which we at True Terpenes are deeply grateful. Much of Dr. Russo's work has served as a scientific foundation for the work we do, and when David Heldreth and I had the chance to talk to Dr. Russo, our co-founder Ben Cassiday jumped at the opportunity to join us. Much like an actual lighthouse, Dr. Russo lives on a remote island off the coast of Washington, and thanks to our friend Shango, we found our way to the lodges at Vashon Island and had a conversation with the good doctor. Here's our interview with Dr. Ethan Russo. All right, we are here, Forest for the Trees podcast, very special podcast. We're here at the lodges at Vashon Island. Our genuine thanks to them for being accommodating hosts for a podcast to pop up and have a conversation today. Very, very special. Outside of our main guest, we're also here with Ben Cassiday, co-founder of True Terpenes, our glorious sponsor and payer of paychecks. We're here today with Dr. Ethan Russo, who is a Vashon Island native resident, and thank you for making time out of your day to come visit us.
My pleasure.
So there's an immense conversation to be had here. Tell us about the 30 years prior to making your name in cannabis. You were a neuroscientist, you were an ethnobotanist. Tell us about what led you to your path and career in cannabinoids and scientific exploration.
Sure. Well, I had an interest in medicinal plants when I was a teenager. People may remember somebody called Yule Gibbons, who advertised for grape nuts, saying they tasted like wild hickory nuts. He actually wrote several books about foraging in the forests and fields and seashores, and one of them was Stalking the Wild Herbs. And that was an interesting book to me, and I applied some of it, like using jewelweed to treat poison ivy, which was rampant where I grew up in Massachusetts. But that all sort of went by the wayside when I went to medical school and took the standard pharmacology courses and went on to residencies in pediatrics and neurology. However, after I'd been in practice about 7 years, it occurred to me that we really weren't making the gains with standard drugs that I would hope. And every time someone came in and failed the prior therapy, we had to choose some less desirable alternative, often more toxic than the previous one. So this rekindled an interest in alternatives, specifically medicinal plants. And that led me to study Spanish so that I could do research in the Amazon, which is still, at this point on Earth, probably the largest reservoir of human knowledge about medicinal plants, where there still are indigenous people that use this as their primary mode of treatment. Along the way, as a neurologist, I certainly had patients that were using cannabis medicinally. The first one, aside from college, where particularly I had women friends who were using cannabis to treat menstrual cramps. That was really common. At that time, I wasn't aware of the whole rich history of cannabis as medicine, however. But in 1980, when I was a resident in neurology at the Seattle VA, I remember one of the attending neurologists sort of had a smirk on his face and handed me a chart and said he wanted me to see this particular guy. So I got into it, and it turned out he had an autoimmune disease called myasthenia gravis, which produces generalized muscle weakness and often comes in attacks, and there are drugs that are used to use it, but they aren't necessarily all that helpful in every instance. So this guy had a really severe case of this, and several times a year ended up in the intensive care unit on a ventilator because of paralysis from this disorder. However, this pattern had changed because he started putting cannabis in his smoking tobacco. And he showed me, and There were flecks of what appeared to be cannabis in his tobacco. And since he did that, he was down to 0 to 1 admissions a year. So this was sort of intriguing. I admit I probably didn't think that much about it at the time, but certainly when I got into practice, particularly among multiple sclerosis patients, probably a third of my patients were using cannabis. And this was in the 90s in Montana. So we're not talking downtown San Francisco or anything like that. And I'm sure the same kind of situation obtained in many other parts of the country. But between my medicinal plant research and what I was seeing with my patients, which also included various people with epilepsy that were using cannabis as an adjunct, this really piqued my interest. After spending 3 months in Peru in the Amazon rainforest, Parque Nacional del Manu, when I came back, it was right at the end of 1995. 1996 was a momentous year for cannabis as medicine because that's when Prop 215 was voted in California. And very quickly I got embroiled in the whole controversy surrounding clinical cannabis, let's call it. And very soon I was studying it intensively and trying to do research of my own, which involved applying to the federal authorities to get permission to do this kind of thing, which to this day remains an extremely cumbersome process. And in the course of things, I was getting stonewalled in my efforts, but through my usual adolescent rebellion, even at an advancing age, I wanted to do it all the more. Hence, a new career was born.
And, something that really comes to mind for me is hearing that story is when you were approaching it from a clinical setting, was there a point in time when you thought that it was just like a palliative medicine more so than a greater effect? Like when you say, you start seeing patients use cannabis and have positive results, did you think at first that it was just pain relief and maybe relief from nausea, and then you start to understand, there's, like you had mentioned, you start seeing somebody go from 4 admissions to an ER in a year to a single admission in a year. Like, is there kind of like at first you thought it just had, great, it reduced the side effects of a condition, and then you started to realize that you could actually systemically treat?
Right. So what you're describing is the difference between a palliative treatment, something that helps a condition, versus a cure. Let's be clear. There are very few things that cannabis cures, but in neurology, there's almost no medicine that cures anything. We're dealing with a specialty where you're lucky if 30% get a great result, and another 30% get some mild increment of improvement, but there's always like a hardcore 30% where nothing you do helps. However, when we look at that hardcore 30%, cannabis helps a lot of them. So to me, it was clearly a treatment that worked where other things didn't, and as such was and remains extremely valid and valuable in dealing with conditions that we term intractable.
And you saw a number of isolated cases in which it helped and kind of pointed you in the direction of it being a panacea for a lot of things, yes?
Sure. I mean, let's take the situation with MS. In the United States, this really came to the fore through HIV/AIDS activists. But in terms of the numbers, at least in the 90s, the biggest group of patients using cannabis as medicine were probably multiple sclerosis. The same was true in England, which prompted actually the GW Pharmaceuticals development program of Sativex. But in that group, here's what I saw. People used it for varying symptoms, particularly spasticity, muscle tightness, but also treating pain, treating sleep disturbance, treating spasms, and bladder symptoms. All of these things have gotten proven benefit from treatment with cannabis, but there was something else that was really key. MS is a really cruel disorder in that primarily affects younger people at onset, especially women, and it waxes and wanes. It's what's called remitting relapsing disorder. One of the really most difficult things for a patient adjusting to it is they might be fine one day, and the next day they'll wake up and they're weak on the right side and can't function. And it's this uncertainty can drive people crazy. So adding anxiety and uncertainty to disability is a really crushing thing for people in terms of their life goals. What I saw with cannabis was that when people used it on a regular basis, beyond the symptomatic relief, their adjustment to this uncertainty with this cruel disorder was markedly benefited. That people had a real adjustment in attitude and found that they could laugh at themselves or the craziness of the situation where you're fine one minute and the next you can't manage because of the physical handicaps.
And when did you start writing?
Well, it was really pretty soon after 1996. I started by doing grant applications to National Institutes of Health. But at that time, one of my mentors, Vero Tip Tyler, had encouraged me to write a book on medicinal herbs. And so I was in the process of that. But at the same time, the publisher involved at Heldreth Press was interested in cannabis, and I began a journal called the Journal of Cannabis Therapeutics, which first appeared in 2001. There was a long lead-up that was required, having to get an editorial board. But in the meantime, in 1998, I published my first formal journal article in the journal called Pain on cannabis and migraine, and that was my big research focus early on. Because migraine, again, is one of these disorders where we've got tons of medicines, either used at the time or preventively. So there are two different kinds of focuses in treatment. What do you do when you have a headache, and what do you do to prevent headaches? Interestingly, cannabis is one of the rare drugs that works in both instances. And there was a tremendous history attached to that, particularly in the 19th century when it was used in Europe and the U.S. One of the primary treatments of migraine. Now, people may say, well, they really didn't have anything. But figure this, as late as 1915, Sir William Osler, who's considered one of the founders of modern medicine, described it as the best medicine for migraine, and I'm not sure that it's really any different now, although it still hasn't entered the mainstream, and I still haven't been able to do the randomized controlled trials that I began to try to do in 1997. So, yeah, it's been 22 years.
That's awesome. As a quick sidebar, just because we are on Vashon Island, this is where you live, do you still continue your plant lust and your foraging, that aspect of your personality?
Oh, yeah, I forage in the backyard.
Yeah, believe that.
I'm trying to set up what's called an edible landscape in our yard. We've got a 1/4 acre, and I like it when during the season when I can go out and just pick berries off the various bushes and trees. Yeah. So, yeah, that's it. I haven't quite figured out where the best mushroom areas are on Vashon, but hopefully that'll come.
Isn't Paul Stamets up here somewhere?
Yeah, he's it's an odd one. It's probably 30 miles as the seagull flies, but with ferries and skirting around this bay and that bay, it probably takes 2 hours to get there.
I would expect it to be a weird outlier island for Paul Stamets, the weird mushroom guy outlier.
Well,
who's
we'd
the
love
coolest.
to get him here. I haven't seen him in some time, but we've been friends since about 1992.
That's awesome. I know for all of us here, like a deeply influential character for sure.
Definitely. Ethan, what I wanted to start off with really is just describing, I don't think we've really ever had an opportunity to talk about, but how your work inspired the work that we now do today on a very real level. It actually, shortly after Taming THC was published in 2011, both independently, both my business partner Chris and myself stumbled upon it using Google Scholar while we were in school. And that, I just remember I was in Michigan working with medical marijuana patients at the very advent of that program. And we went from making ethanol extractions, what we were calling RSO at the time, and handing those out, to realizing that we were boiling everything off. And we didn't know what to do about that at the time, but we knew that we needed to start being careful. And that was really a pivotal time from when, and that paper really explained to me. I can remember getting really high quality cannabis visually and olfactorily, but not feeling anything from it. And the Taming THC was the first time that I had any sort of vocabulary or toolbox to really understand what else might be going on there. And so, that was really, like, I would say, the first step in my educated cannabis progression. And then, moving forward, kind of like the next, I had moved out to Oregon. I met Chris. We started doing these medical clinics, and we're meeting with all of these patients, and we're doing the administration side. But working with physicians who needed to be rather conservative, they were really signing the recommendation and saying, really just doing the bare basics of, I acknowledge you have a qualifying medical condition. However, I'm not going to go and suggest to you how to necessarily use the plant, because they were just, there was a lot of concern about discipline from state medical board.
Sure.
So,
well, yeah, I mean, basically they were adhering to the Ninth Circuit decision,
Exactly.
Conan versus McCarthy, or Conan versus Gonzalez, ultimately, basically saying that doctors could discuss cannabis with their patients, but they couldn't help in any way for them to procure it.
Yeah.
They couldn't provide it, etc. So that is where the law still stands, basically.
And so because of that decision, the physicians that we were working with, we'd check them into the clinic, we'd get them comfortable, we'd let them know, you're going to talk to a physician, he's going to take care of your paperwork, and then when you return to the front, we're actually going to give you recommendations on where to go and what to look for, and we've got we've got this packet of information to help you start to begin to use cannabis, because we had always really focused on being a very conservative practice. So it was a lot of the types of people that you're talking about. I think our first office was actually in the Multiple Sclerosis Society of Portland's office. So having that first paper inspire us to do that work, we were in pursuit of trying to understand how to better really lead patients into better, more predictable outcomes. And I think actually the way that we first got into contact with you was I'd looked up your email through one of your bios randomly online, and just sent a contact and said, hey, can we send you some samples of what we're doing? We had this little tiny side project basically in Chris's garage where we started sourcing terpenes, and just wanted to kind of find out what you thought about that. And then shortly after that, Shango had invited us up to the Vimeo meeting when you talked at the theater in town here on Vashon. And that was kind of the first time that we had an opportunity to meet and shake hands. Again, just kind of a pivotal moment in our career, because we just realized that we were really fortunate to be in the Pacific Northwest and to be in this time and space and have the relationships to be able to talk to somebody like yourself and start to build a relationship. So just want to say, in a big way from the very beginning, your work, public facing, really inspired what it is that we do. And one of the questions that I just had that I think I've wanted to ask for a while is, so many people do research under a veil, and they only share it either within the organization that they're working or just the scientific community. But it seems like you've always went above and beyond, and you've really been a public educator. And from, I really just a personal question of, why is that? Why do you spend so much time and effort going out to public events and teaching the general cannabis community and others about what it is that you've been so fascinated with?
Well, I guess above all, I feel a responsibility. Beyond that, I am really excited about this work. I have been for, the 25 years I've been doing it. And I would like to share that with people and hope that they get excited about it too. Ultimately, I hope that it fosters change. We've got an odd situation here, which is patients and public in general get it in terms of cannabis as medicine. We've got to drag some of the aging politicians to a position where they understand its utility and safety as well. So yeah, I feel a responsibility, and I would just say, in my current position, one of the questions as Director of Research and Development at the International Cannabis and Cannabinoids Institute, one of the questions was, I spend a good bit of time doing public lectures and responding to patients. Is that still okay? And they said absolutely. Now, what I don't do is if I get a query from somebody in a commercial endeavor where they're just plumbing the depths for information that has commercial implications, we're going to want to contract with them and really dig in more depth to try and answer their question and advance their goals.
Okay, interesting. As far as the commercial endeavors and all that sort of thing goes, I feel, we haven't worked together on that side of things at this point, but we have been fortunate enough to provide samples for some of your colleagues. And one of the things that came out of that situation, and I can't remember the gentleman's name offhand right now, but I was just so surprised at the small quantity that he had requested from me. He said, can you provide to me a natural sourced 99% plus sample of myrcene? I think I'm going to need 2 grams over the next 3 years.
Well, you know what that points out? It points out incredible potency of essential oils and their terpenoid components. And it explains something else. People look at cannabis and its components, specifically the cannabinoids, and they know that THC is powerful. With CBD, you need bigger numbers. Then they look at the terpenoid fractions, and it's tiny, and nobody thinks it can be doing anything. Unfortunately, they're sometimes right because of extraction techniques that squander the terpenoid components. But the fact is that a guy named Adams wrote a chapter in an important reference book and pointed out that concentrations above 0.05% of a specific terpenoid can have a meaningful effect. That's 500 parts per billion. Just a few molecules of a specific terpenoid are something that we can sense with our noses and evokes a reaction, emotional or otherwise. And it's not just emotional. These are really important substances in terms of their effects. Now, the plants are not producing these for our enjoyment or to make us high or even to modify the effects of THC, all of which they do. Rather, they serve ecological roles in the plant's life, either to attract good bugs, to repel bad bugs, to act as antibiotics. They're really myriad effects. It depends on the ecological milieu that the plant is in at any given moment, what it's going to produce. But we can harness that towards our own ends, and it's just a happy accident of nature that these plant chemicals have such profound effects on our own biochemistry. And that's one of the reasons that I love this topic. When I started studying this, which was back in the 90s, and interesting, Paul Stamets' partner, now I'm blanking on the name, Dusty Yell. She introduced me to essential oils. This would have been in 1996. And immediately when I got into it, I realized, gee, these are in all these plants, and they're particularly in cannabis. Soon after that, I met guys that have been very influential in the industry, John McPartland, David Watson, David Pate, Rob Clark. They all knew about cannabis terpenoids. And then I really dug into it in a big way. And what I found is something that you often see in science, that you've got cannabis literature and you've got terpenoid literature, and never the twain shall meet. And that really was the case. John McPartland was really the first to write about effects of cannabis terpenoids and how they might synergize with the cannabinoids. And then we wrote a paper together in 2001.
To that point, had it been on basically the secret language of plants? Is that where the studies had been?
Well, aromatherapists knew about this forever, but, there's a problem there in terms of the scientific acceptance of the discipline. Aromatherapy, which I think is great, is something that the average physician, if he knows even what it is going to regard as tantamount to witchcraft. Part of the problem is the early scientific studies showed an innate variability. It can be the case that when a person is exposed to a certain essential oil, this person's going to think that it's stimulating and another one's going to think it's relaxing. So interestingly, in parallel with what happens with cannabis and other psychoactive substances, set and setting really come into it. You have to know what the person's baseline is. Where are they at, and how is this going to change how they see the world, if it does. And some of the studies really weren't very rigorous. But certainly John and I wanted to bring this in the realm of science and really, really explore the synergies, the boosting effects of these tiny amounts of essential oil components with the cannabinoids, and how they could be harnessed medicinally.
And what was the name of that paper that the two of you worked on, or what format did it go out in?
It was in the Journal of Cannabis Therapeutics, and this is so long ago, it's a challenge, but I remember that the sum is it was about we'll need to dig that out.
Okay.
Ben has done a deep dive on you. Like, he will present you with things that you've never even seen about yourself. You're like Nardwuar.
Well, it's just a reflection of how long this has been doing. That's my second senior moment already.
Well, I think for anybody that's listening, I think if we search the Journal of Cannabis Therapeutics in your name, and it's 2001.
Yeah.
Okay, 2001. So we'll be able to dredge that up. And then you want to?
Oh, I was curious. We're talking about aromatherapy in this regard, but what do you think about the oral use of terpenes as well with cannabinoids?
Well, that's a great question. It is clear that these are going to be most effective on inhalation. Now, not necessarily smoking. There are a lot of problems with smoking beyond the particulate matter, the side effects that everybody knows about, the cough, the phlegm. Beyond that, smoking squanders a lot of the terpenoid content. A lot is going to boil away in side stream smoke. So if someone's going to inhale, vaporization is going to be far better and preserve the terpenoid components best, hopefully with some kind of extract that is rich in terpenoids to begin with, and that is a challenge maybe we'll get into later. Orally, they certainly are absorbed. Part of the problem is that through the gut and then the liver, a lot of these get metabolized very quickly. Let me give you an example. Tiny amounts of limonene that are inhaled have a strong sort of stimulatory and antidepressant effect. There have been limonene gel caps that have been available. I think they're 50 milligrams. Somebody can take one of those, and they're unlikely to necessarily feel any change in mood. So on the one hand, a few milligrams inhaled might have a visible effect, whereas the oral agent doesn't necessarily.
How much do you think that is like? As you mentioned earlier, emotional set and setting interaction because of the vaporization. Just like a chain reaction.
It could be, but I think there's a real difference here. Now, the important thing I'd like to emphasize, though, is that I am not saying at all that they're not active orally. They clearly are. And with others, you might not have the same kind of decrement of effect. I do believe strongly that oral cannabis-based preparations should be as rich in terpenoid components as they can possibly be to harness these attributes and benefits.
Well, it makes me wonder, you said a gel cap specifically. Well, it's encapsulated, it's not aromatic. It makes me wonder if it's an aromatic preparation that actually has scent, if even though it, like, in our experience back when we first started, we were making these gummies that had retroactive, looking backwards, it was just an internal thing, but far too much terpene in it. And we were burping up terpenes, and we were getting, you were breathing out for hours afterwards. And I wonder if that has a, if you were to compare it to like a hoppy IPA or something like that, where you're getting the aromatics, that's the N1 nerve. If you're exhaling, do you think that there's any potential for stimulation in that regard?
Oh yeah, I think that there is. With scent, people have to understand it's sort of a direct route to the brain. At the top of our nasal passages is the olfactory nerves, cranial nerve 1. That sort of goes straight to the amygdala and other limbic system areas, emotional centers of the brain, without any filtration through the usual pathway through the thalamus. Most other inputs to the brain have this level of control at the thalamus before they go elsewhere. So they're already modified. This is sort of the proverbial straight shot to the emotional centers. And that's why, the common example is someone opens up a drawer in a house, their clothes in the drawer, and there's a lavender sachet. And they immediately have a memory of their grandmother who used lavender in the home. There's nothing so evocative and has such a tight link to memory as a scent. And this is not just psychological. It's the way we're wired, very basically.
Okay.
I'm deeply interested more in veering the conversation towards the natural world and why we all think terpenes occur at such high levels in cannabis and what that reflects in plants in general. But I know there's plenty else.
Okay. Just want to make sure you're good before we move on here.
Absolutely.
So I think to move it forward through the content that we were hoping to get through today, you said 2001, you had a build up to with your journal article and whatnot. It took about 7 years. You said you started about 96, or I guess that's 5 years. And then there was as far as I know, Taming THC was 2011.
Right.
Was there any work within this space of aromatics or cannabis published by yourself in between that time?
I wrote various things and included pertinent facts about terpenoid cannabinoid interactions. But that article came about in an interesting way. The father of cannabinology, we'll call it, Raphael Mechoulam, was born in 1930. So in 2010 was his 80th birthday. And as part of the celebration of that, a symposium was put together in Israel, to which I was invited. I'm proud to say that he has been one of my mentors, and I was invited to speak. So, the obvious question is, what am I going to talk about at this momentous occasion? Raphael Mechoulam had, along with Shimon ben Shabbat, had developed the concept of the entourage effect. Originally, they applied this to the endogenous cannabinoids, the endocannabinoids, and gave the example that in terms of pain and inflammation, the endocannabinoids had a certain level of activity which was markedly boosted when there was this cast of other characters which on their own didn't seem to do very much, particularly palmityl ethanolamide. We know it has anti-inflammatory activity, but the two together have synergy. So they coined this entourage effect. This was in 1998. The next year they had another article when they pointed out that the same thing could apply to cannabis, which had already occurred to me. But this is 1999 now. And they said that it was a theoretical construct and hadn't really been proven in practice. Well, 20 years have passed, and we have a great deal of evidence now of the true synergy of these different components. Subsequent to that, there was a lot of behind-the-scenes experiments going on. I'm not sure how much we want to get into this, but in fact, I've already been outed by Michael Bacchus in the latest edition of his book. It's probably in the footnotes. So
is that
in the
Cannabis Pharmacology?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Second edition. So,
can you share just a little bit about that?
I might as well at this point. There are a large number of unindicted co-conspirators, but they know who they are. and people have probably assumed worse. But some of the guys I mentioned, John McPartland, David Watson, Rob Clark, we've all been very hot, if you will, on the idea of what the terpenoids do. And they are really the things that distinguish one chemovar of cannabis from another. We all independently recognized at early ages in our own cannabis usage, which for me began in 1970, that there was something different about one cannabis to another, what people mistakenly call strains. Strains are bacteria or viruses. I prefer the term chemical varieties, chemovars. So why is this one getting you out and feeling like you want to run in the woods? Why, on the other hand, is this one giving you total couch lock where you're immobilized? Obviously it's biochemical at some level. It's clear at this point that we've hit a breeding bottleneck. It's not a problem with the plant's genetics. It's a problem with the breeding, and it's a byproduct of prohibition that we now have a whole bunch of different types of cannabis that are rich in THC and high in one particular terpenoid, myrcene. Everything is like that. Even the CBD predominant varieties are rich in myrcene, generally to the exclusion of these other terpenoids. So there are a lot of gray hairs like me out there that wax prosaic about the cannabis of old. And it wasn't on average as potent, but clearly there was a greater variety of effects that people got from different chemovars of cannabis as compared to now. And so there are a lot of the older guys that really don't like what's out there now. Now, one hopes that they still have kept seeds from the olden days, maybe some of the old land races that used to be available in decades past. But we need to recapture some of that and really demonstrate the breadth of activity that's possible from cannabis. And that extends not just to recreation, but clearly to therapeutics as well.
You know, you mentioned the strains of old. A question that I had kind of positioned to ask later, but I think is relevant now is, have you been following the development of the type 3 and the CBG dominant varieties that are popping up right now in the hemp space?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We might as well call out the people doing the work.
Yeah.
Seth Crawford in Oregon and Jeremy Plum also in Oregon. These are guys that are really doing innovative breeding work. Some of this is new. It wasn't that these things couldn't exist before, but this is a very plastic plant in terms of breeding. You can make it do anything if you put the time and effort and money into it. And the beauty of it is, all of this can be done with conventional breeding. There's no need to be using CRISPR technology or genetic modification or teaching yeast to do it. The plant can do it. It doesn't mean it's easy or fast, but my strong bias is that that's the preferred approach. There's a paper coming out on Wednesday where they've taught yeast through genetic engineering to make a panoply of different cannabinoid acids. And that may have industrial application. Particularly, they're excited because they can feed it different chemicals and create new cannabinoids. However, I would say that I don't know how far this will go. The yields that they're getting are pretty tiny. Don't compare with what the plant can do, number one. Number two, can they reproduce something that's going to be equivalent to a high-quality cannabis chemovar? I doubt it. Plus, to date, they're really leaving out the whole terpenoid entourage. So getting back to the subject of the day.
But you say new cannabinoids, so cannabinoids that are not endocannabinoids and are not phytocannabinoids?
Well, no, they'd be synthetic cannabinoids.
Okay.
So structurally different than the 150 or more that the plant can make now.
Wow.
But taken individually, getting one of those molecules to the point where it's FDA approved, it's a long shot. It's 1,000 to 1 shot. And basically, it's going to be like any synthetic molecule. That means between $700 million and $1.2 billion in production costs to get it through the full range of clinical trials, toxicology, and everything else.
And like you said, there's those hurdles to overcome where it's not as productive and it's not as efficacious.
Right. And the idea that you're going to have one single molecule that can do what the panoply of cannabis chemicals can do, I think the chances are very, very low. Now, it might be good for some individual malady, and certainly companies are going to be pursuing this like crazy because of patent rights and intellectual property and all that stuff. So this kind of commerce will happen. I'm just skeptical that it really is going to supplant, to use a funny word, what cannabis can do.
Well, on the regard of using the plant, what do you think about the difficulties with the environmental factors affecting the plant's terpene and cannabinoid profile and then manufacturing something replicatable?
Yeah, we've got this situation. Ideally, it'd be great if here in the Northwest we could grow all year and control for things like rainstorms, windstorms, what your neighbor is spraying or things like that. If we're talking about a pharmaceutical development program, it's pretty clear that it's a necessity, not to grow indoors, but in greenhouses is probably the best compromise. For large-scale production where extracts are being made and the climate permits, clearly outdoor culture may be an advantage. But for industrial applications, that's going to be the way to go. But yeah, we have opposing influences of control versus the ability to produce in bulk. So there are certain situations where you need a controlled environment to achieve consistency, the kind of consistency that, say, has gone into the pharmaceutical products that GW Pharmaceuticals has produced. Just for full disclosure, I worked for them full-time for 11 years and was associated for 16 years. But that's...
And your former mentor just signed on pretty recently too, right?
Yeah, Michel just signed a deal to sell a lot of his patents and do research for GW.
Well, he's been associated since
For-
the beginning, off and on. Yeah.
Interesting. So I think what I'd love to get on it's 2019. You've been rehearsing and delivering this message for a number of years. Could you give us your most recent definition of what the entourage effect is?
Okay, so this is the concept that we have certain, let's call them soloists. These would be the well-known cannabinoids such as tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, and cannabidiol, CBD. So they are producing the bulk of the pharmacology that we're looking for in terms of treating disorders. So whether it's spasticity or pain or inflammation or seizures, those are the main players. Then we have this other cast of characters, let's call it the harmony, that's provided by the terpenoids that are modulating the effects of the main players and producing what we hope in the end is beautiful music, meaning a very therapeutic effect. And there are just numerous examples, so maybe we could just give a couple. I've mentioned myrcene already. I would emphasize this is not a bad molecule. It is anti-inflammatory. It does have pain relieving properties of its own, but it's sort of narcotic effect. On its own, myrcene is somewhat sedating. Combined with THC, however, it's remarkably more sedating. There's clearly synergy there. Unfortunately, again, there's so much myrcene in most common cannabis chemovars that the overwhelming effect is one of sedation, or couch lock, as it's known colloquially. That's great if you want to sleep. It's not good if you're a patient with chronic pain that has to work or study. So that one we get a little too much of in general. Can be good, but we've got too much. Let's contrast that with alpha-pinene. Pinene is going to be familiar, although people aren't aware of it necessarily, because it's the odor of pine needles and other conifers. Why is it so nice in the Pacific Northwest to take a break and walk in the woods? Well, the Japanese have a term for this. It's called Shinrin Yoku, forest bathing. And it's not just the sights and sounds, but that smell of alpha-pinene in the air actually clears your brain, improves memory specifically, and in combination with THC, we have a blunting of the short-term memory impairment that THC is infamous for producing. So again, we've got your person who has to work or study. They've got symptoms. They've got to treat with a cannabis-based preparation. If they have alpha-pinene along with the THC, chances are they're going to think clearly and be able to function better, getting the reduction of symptoms, but also a reduction in side effects. Other examples, we mentioned limonene already, powerful antidepressant and immune stimulant. If you walk down the aisle in the supermarket anywhere in this country, you're bombarded with a citrus scent. Why is that? Well, both directly and psychologically, citrus is equated with cleanliness. Limonene, the main component, is a great degreasing agent. Additionally, when we smell it, we think of clean. It also elevates our mood. And so it's there because it works, and it's there because we have the psychological connotation to it. Another example, a really fascinating molecule is caryophyllene. It has the distinction of being a terpenoid and a cannabinoid. It turns out to be a direct stimulant of the CB2 receptor. CB2 is the non-psychoactive receptor. So when a drug or chemical stimulates this receptor, it exerts an anti-inflammatory effect, but there are lots of other things that it does. It also helps prevent scar tissue fibrosis. Agents that stimulate CB2 also have an anti-addictive effect. Caryophyllene then in cannabis can really contribute in a very meaningful way to the benefits that someone can get medicinally if they have a preparation that has a good amount of it.
So it sounds like just in really, it sounds like just like any other therapy, the expectation and the symptoms to be treated are really important. And I guess I say this in context of the whole plant versus isolated and recombined kind of schools of thought. We've got kind of a war raging within cannabis consumers and product manufacturers over that topic right there. You'll have people that know very little about the chemistry of the plant but are adamant that it shouldn't be separated. And then you've got people on the other end, usually in commercial endeavors, that are selling isolated compounds and saying, no, it's the same, or in fact, maybe it's even better, making all sorts of different claims. And it sounds like from what you're saying, it really depends on what somebody is treating and what sort of outcome that you're actually after. If you're treating something that can be treated with just THC, and if it's nausea and it's nausea with the intention of keeping somebody active, and then a THC and an alpha pinene combination might be right in the wheelhouse. But if it's sedation, if we're looking after trying to soothe somebody's pain and maybe allow them to sleep, then we're going a different direction with things. But it doesn't really sound like it's probably a definite like concrete answer one way or the other. It's all about the person, the set and setting, and then also what you're after.
Right. Well, you've certainly identified one of the major areas of contention right now. But let's give a concrete example. In 2018, the drug called Epidiolex was FDA approved for treatment of Dravet and Lennox-Gastaut syndromes, two types of severe seizure disorders. It's a 97% pure cannabidiol preparation. So there's a tiny amount of other cannabinoids and a smattering of terpenoids. We know that this works. It's been in several phase 3 clinical trials. The doses that they're using are very high, up to 2,500 milligrams.
Wow.
This contributes to the expense of which is considerable. But there was a paper that came out a few months ago by Fabrizio Pamplona, where he compared the effects and dosing of pure CBD up to 2,500 milligrams a day versus preparations with CBD and other components, and found out that you get pretty much equivalent results with whole cannabis preparations with CBD at about 22% of the dose. Also with fewer side effects, because at the very high doses, CBD in isolation can produce some drug-drug interactions, particularly with some of the sedative drugs like clobazam that are used in conjunction to treat seizures. So this is an example of cannabis synergy. Although it's often vilified, having a tiny amount of THC along with a larger amount of CBD is often the best approach to treating many disorders. Let's put it in context. Too much THC has side effects, but as compared in proper dosing, properly administered, it is an extremely useful, versatile drug with a high safety margin, much better than most accepted pharmaceuticals out there.
I think I heard you say in the recent series that you shot with Shango Lowe's on Shaping Fire that, and forgive me for forgetting the source, but I think you had said the greatest amount of efficacy in patients is usually maxed out at about 30 milligrams in a day.
Yeah, I like to even keep it lower. If someone has begun slowly and titrated, adjusted the dose upwards, generally they're best off capping out at about 15 milligrams of THC total a day. 30 would be the upper limits. Above that, there's a greater likelihood of getting side effects like anxiety, sedation, but also the development of tolerance, meaning that people make a mistake if they are taking an amount of medicine, cannabis-based medicine, and basing the amount they take on when they feel high. Now, if they want to feel high, that's something else. But most patients are looking for symptom control without impairment. And to do that, it's best to proceed very slowly and limit the total amount of THC. Now, the advantage is, with the advent of these type 3 CBD predominant type of chemovars, we can have a very large amount of CBD exerting its benefits with only a smaller amount of accompanying THC. And hopefully a lot of good terpenoids too, but we still need much better selective breeding so that the CBD predominant plants also are predominant in terpenoids other than myrcene, so we're avoiding this sedative effect.
Okay. You know, going along with the topic of the entourage effect, I have here a vial. I will say I won't say that it's necessarily pleasing by odor. However, I suspect, and actually, sorry, it's been analyzed. It's got quite a large content of beta-caryophyllene in it, and it's from the 2017 hemp harvest in Oregon. And I have a friend that's manufacturing a product with that and documenting the response in its users on scar tissue, burns, and eczema and psoriasis, and just having phenomenal results with it. But I was hoping you could speak to, it seems like there's this trend right now. Consumers are starting to learn, and the general public is starting to learn about terpenes, and they're referring to the entire essential oil content of cannabis as terpenes, but we know that's not true. I was hoping maybe you could speak a little bit further into what other compounds make up the aroma and the essential oil content.
Well, first, defining terms. Terpenes are hydrocarbons, so they have carbon and hydrogen. That's it. Terpenoids may have oxygen and rarely other compounds, but terpenoids is the more encompassing term, and is the one I usually use. Ideally, again, through selective breeding, we will have a combination of particular terpenoids that are going to make that particular cannabis chemovar really good, hopefully for a variety of purposes. And it bears emphasis, selective breeding can get you there. So it's possible not just to breed for high THC or high CBD, but also high amounts of limonene, caryophyllene, or whatever terpenoid that you'd like. The good thing is, to go on a tangent from our previous question, we don't have to just inhale or ingest these. Part of aromatherapy has always been primarily application to the skin, and terpenoids are very therapeutic for a variety of dermatological conditions, and we know that these clearly work. They're also absorbed very well, and in doing so, they produce blood levels, and it does, initially at least, bypass the liver, which is more of an issue with oral ingestion.
I'm also kind of curious, what do you think about some of the cannaflavins or anthocyanins and some of these other components that are also found in the plant, and how some of the effects might be topically or inhaled or even orally?
Sure. Well, cannabis is a phytochemical factory, and it's not just the flowers. To give the example, we have the roots. They produce triterpenoids, which aren't in the flowers, and a little bit of alkaloid. These have been used for thousands of years for various therapeutic purposes, and there's no relationship between what's in the flower and the roots, but sometimes they're used for the same thing, so that's really fascinating. But yeah, I'm particularly interested in canflavin A, which is a very interesting anti-inflammatory compound. It doesn't work the way most anti-inflammatories do. The non-steroidal anti-inflammatories all work through inhibition of cyclooxygenase and COX-1 and COX-2. But all of those drugs, so this is aspirin, naproxen, all of those drugs have the liability of producing the possibility of ulcers, heart attacks, and strokes. Canflavin doesn't have that kind of profile, won't do any of those things. So, that's a definite area of interest. In terms of the anthocyanidins, these would be colored type compounds, most familiar through berries, blueberries, blackberries, and the like. So there are a lot of interesting purple-colored cannabis varieties out there. I think if these were properly extracted and ingested, maybe they would exert benefits as antioxidants and agents that would help prevent cancer if they were being ingested on a regular basis. Because we know that nuts and berries do the same kinds of things.
Do you have any knowledge? Earlier, you had mentioned a bottleneck in the breeding that was resulting in. Is that due to kind of like enzymatic pathways, like for the way that the plant is using its GPP to create either cannabinoids or other compounds? Or
no, it's not a problem with the plant. It's a problem with the approach.
Like the gene pool?
I blame it on politics, to be really honest. What happens when a substance is prohibited? Well, the incentive then is to produce it in the most concentrated form so that it's easier to hide. So it's true that there was beer during alcohol prohibition, but mostly it was bathtub gin. Distillation was the way, because this heavy stuff, alcohol, was most potent in that form, and you get the most bang for the buck. What we've seen over the last few decades is an increase in potency with respect to THC, but to the exclusion of CBD until recently, and without due regard to what else is going on, which is specifically at the same time, we've had this increase in myrcene concentration to the detriment of everything else.
It's like the boom in agriculture and the homogenization of things you see on a grocery shelf, and the resurgence you see now in heirloom varietals. And like you said, hopefully there's a guy cataloging these old landrace varieties, which I think is kind of what you're speaking to.
Yeah. So let's take the tomato, for example. These days you get tomatoes year-round. They might look okay. They're tasteless. The consistency isn't right. Anybody who's been fortunate enough to be in Italy during the summer, they will experience a true tomato for the first time. And it's a world apart. But, I mean, this goes along with farm-to-table movements and things like this. We are very good in this country at mass production. It's been a tradition for more than a century, but it doesn't always mean that the quality goes along commensurately with that.
Okay. I think maybe switching gears a little bit and just progressing the conversation. I read an interview with you, and I can't remember the gentleman you were speaking with, but it was you speaking on specifically the abolishing of the use of the terms indica, sativa, and hybrid, because plant morphology has little to nothing to do with the actual chemical expression of that plant. I was hoping to, just like we did with the entourage effect, kind of have you just unpack that,
Sure.
The basics.
Okay, well, let's go back in time a little bit. Back in the 16th century, possibly before, was the first time we heard the term cannabis sativa, which means cultivated cannabis. One of the first was Leonhard Fuchs in Germany. A couple of hundred years later, Linnaeus, the famous Swedish botanist, systematized plant and animal nomenclature, binomials, two names, a genus and species, and he designated cannabis sativa again. Didn't coin it, but that became the standard at that point. What he was describing was European hemp. 25 years later, Antoine Lamarck described something called cannabis indica. And we have the original voucher specimens. He had a more densely foliated plant, but with narrow leaflets. That was from India, that he called cannabis indica, that he felt was a separate species. Fast forward to to the 20th century, a lot of importation of hash from Afghanistan. Those plants were a meter high with very broad leaflets and very distinct effects. That came to be labeled as indica, although it looked nothing like what Lamarck had described. So basically, what we've got a situation now, in colloquial terms, people will say that sativa is a head high and indica is a body stone. And people make that kind of distinction, and they talk about this variety being primarily indica or sativa or a hybrid, but it's all nonsense. If we look at the biochemistry, almost all of them are going to be high THC, high myrcene. So I'm not... plus, there's a debate of really, were they ever separate species? Any type of cannabis can crossbreed with any other type of cannabis. That doesn't mean that it's one species necessarily. The problem is if you have 12 botanical taxonomists, the people that decide these things, you're going to have 26 different opinions.
Right.
Nobody... This is one of those arguments you can't settle. What I can say is that the terms sativa and indica are purposeless at this point. What the consumer, whether recreational or medical, needs to know is what is in this cannabis and how is it going to affect me or particularly treat my disorder. And that really comes from biochemistry. It doesn't come from some name or what the plant looks like, whether it has wide leaflets, narrow leaflets, whether it's tall or short or any of those things. So that's my pet peeve.
Okay. And so based upon all that, do you have any suggestions for a classification system or it's even some direction that we
Sure.
can follow?
Well, first of all, I think that consumers really have to demand that at point of sale that they have full information about what they're buying. So it's not just cannabinoid profile, but they need terpenoid profile. They also need to know safety factors, that this was grown without pesticides, that it was tested for heavy metals, that it didn't have microbial contamination or anything else. Now, the problem is nobody does this unless it's mandated. This stuff costs money, but I'm always going to weigh in terms of openness, knowledge, and safety. These are critical. And a lot of people are very health conscious. They may go to the supermarket and they're studying labels. People need to be just as discriminating with their cannabis purchases.
Okay. I think it was, I think it was 2016 or 2017, Mark Lewis developed, and I don't know, please further explain, but the phytofacts system. What did you have an involvement in that, or was that, I know that you both presented in 2017.
Sure. Yeah, he developed it. They credit me with inspiring some of this.
Okay.
But it came about because of an understanding and appreciation of the importance of the terpenoid profile, contributing to the effects of a different cannabis chemovar. So the phytofacts is a one-page representation of everything that you need to know about a cannabis variety, including the total cannabinoid and terpenoid content, moisture content, a little picture of the bud. Then where it gets exciting is the terpenoid content, the relative amounts shown in a graphical form where you can color code it and look at it and know immediately what's there predominantly. And then really nice is correlating that with patient experience. So they included data about what people said about the effects. Is it sedating? Is it uplifting? Is it mood elevating? All these things incorporated in one page on a very nice format.
Okay. I've been working on because I feel like we're in this gap right now where we're going to hit another breakthrough, and it's through the collection of data and then the presentation of that data, and it's the I know that Israel has been working in other places have been working on clinical cannabis research for some time, but I feel like we're kind of like waiting for this quantum leap right now within cannabis consumer information, and so until we get to whatever that looks like, whether it's a unified system using something like Phytofax or it's another similar system, I feel like the best thing that we can do is rely on a system that cannabis users have used for millennia, which is self-analysis. And so we've been working on a very basic system. We call it True to Self, and it's basically looking at the three main types of cannabis and adding it, so type 1, type 2, type 3, and adding CBG because that's such an emerging dominant cannabinoid profile that's going to be available because of the hemp work that's been done. And then basically just putting it into a very simple matrix with the dominant terpenes, whether it's the, and I believe it was yourself and Lewis that did superclasses, right? Or
it came out of his work with Matt Giese and others.
So then, so the terpenes that were covered in superclasses, and then another gentleman out of Canada, Philippe Henry, is talking about hyperclasses, but really just taking terpinolene, myrcene, limonene, beta-caryophyllene, and what am I missing?
Pinene?
Yeah, alpha-pinene. So putting it in a matrix that might have 15 squares and saying, okay, prospective patient, this is what we're doing in our clinics. Let's first identify, like you said, the soloists within this ensemble. Let's identify, are you looking for relief that comes from something that's THC dominant, 1-to-1, or CBD dominant, and then looking at, okay, let's fine-tune that experience towards what dominant cannabinoid profile, terpenoid profile do you like paired with that? And so until we have enough data that, and really, kind of clinical proven information to go off of to prescribe this towards people with a label that says for sleep, saying, go in, do it in a trial by or analysis by trial situation, and work yourself through this matrix and identify, did you have a positive experience, did you have a neutral experience, or did you have a negative experience? And then after this exercise, it might take 2 or 3 months to get through. Trips to a dispensary, and you're going to have to be purchasing stuff that's been tested so that you have that analysis. But at the end of that routine, you'd be able to identify largely what works well for you and what doesn't.
Sure. Well, this is one of the ideas behind Phytofax and having the feedback from patients, but it gets extremely complicated. In general, you don't get cannabis with one terpenoid to the exclusion of others. You can breed it so that it may look like that, but often there are going to be 5 primary ones and then up to 100 that are there in some tiny amount. But again, if it's content above 0.05%, which is going to happen with a lot of different components, they're having an effect. Trying to sort that out is difficult. So one of the things we're trying to do in investigating this is what I like to call a deconstruction and reconstruction. And that involves pairings of, initially starting with single compounds, a cannabinoid, a terpenoid, then pairings of 1 and 1, and seeing the effects under very tightly controlled and investigated conditions. Those experiments are underway. It's going to take about 3 years to just get through, say, 3 of the pairings. But hopefully this is going to be the beginning of ongoing research. So this can be done with neuropsychological tests. It can also be done with advanced neuroimaging. We continue to try to encourage experiments in the lab that will demonstrate these synergies. So it's being done. But once you start adding in multiple compounds, it gets very complicated very quickly. And as you can understand, the various permutations, once you get the numbers, it goes up exponentially.
Yeah, it gets complicated. All right. Well, I think up until this point, we've really focused on cannabis consumption, and David introduced me to your talk on the gut theory. And I don't know how I missed it at the end of last year, but it's kind of relatively new to me, and I've dove into it as much as I can over the last couple of weeks. But I was hoping you could explain that, and we could move on to basically maintaining human health using the endocannabinoid system, but not necessarily relying on cannabis alone.
Right. Well, let's start out by saying a lot of what ails us as modern humans is nutritional in origin. Particularly Americans are not eating the way we were designed. At the same time, a huge factor in this is what's going on in our guts. Our guts are filled with bacteria. We would be dead without these. These are what really regulates so many different functions in terms of what gets absorbed, whether we're going to be in an inflammatory or anti-inflammatory state. They are responsible for contributing neurotransmitters that go to the brain. So it's a very complex relationship. If we look at other cultures, say in Africa, the components of the bacteria in their guts are very different to what Americans have. During this interval, say the last century, we've had a huge increase in autoimmune disorders and other inflammatory disorders, and again, a lot of it is based on nutrition. Emphasis on fried foods, unhealthy fats, particularly trans fats that are pro-inflammatory, on and on and on. And this is probably directly responsible for the increase in many of these disorders that we're seeing that just seemingly don't occur in other cultures. Now, for example, as we age in America, there are more and more people being afflicted by Alzheimer's disease. A lot of people attribute that to just people living longer, and that's a factor. But, in fact, in other cultures, you just don't see this. They may not have as many people who live to an advanced age, but when they do, they don't get Alzheimer's disease. So there are a lot of factors involved. But what we know is, at this point, that the gut bacteria, known as the microbiome, is one of the major regulators of the endocannabinoid system. The endocannabinoid system is an innate defensive program, if you will, that regulates just about every aspect of our physiology. Now, it has this interesting name. You've got cannabinoid in the name. And this works through cannabinoid receptors, CB1 and CB2, that we may have mentioned earlier. And that's the direct relationship, because cannabinoids also work through these same receptors. So basically, THC is analogous to an endogenous chemical called anandamide we all have within our bodies, particularly in the brain. And its function is to keep things in balance, what's called homeostasis. The microbiome is critical to human homeostasis, so we need to treat it right. We need to have a better bacterial balance so that we have the good bugs and not the bad bugs. And this can be achieved in part through cannabis. THC actually stimulates a better gut balance, but it also can be done nutritionally through what are called prebiotics and probiotics. Probiotics are beneficial bacteria, like in yogurt, lacto-fermented foods, things of that sort. They can be taken as supplements. But prebiotics are often things that people don't eat enough of. A certain kind of fibrous vegetables, also including the onion family, but burdock root, things of this sort, acacia fiber, that are a feedstock for the beneficial bacteria. In other words, if you have prebiotics in your diet, the microbiome likes it, and you have a better balance of the bacteria that are health promoting and seemingly have a role in helping to treat or even prevent a lot of these autoimmune diseases, multiple sclerosis, other inflammatory conditions, and apparently good for your brain. Clearing up acne, things like this. Now, it sounds too good to be true, but there is absolute substantiation in the medical literature for everything I've just said.
So, with regards to medicine, what is the future? What do you see? What is the future?
Well, the future is wide open. Cannabis is already well established as a treatment for spasticity and now for seizure disorder, for pain. But there's some areas that really haven't been tapped into properly yet. One of the primary uses of cannabis in ages past was in obstetrics and gynecology. And it's sort of been a forbidden territory, but it really needs attention, particularly for some of the more episodic disorders where it really can have tremendous efficacy, say in treating hyperemesis gravidarum or the milder forms of morning sickness. And this doesn't need to be with THC. CBD is antiemetic. Additionally, the cannabinoid acids, THCA and CBDA, could be used in tiny amounts and probably are going to be much more effective than current drugs that put women in the hospital and often are quite ineffective.
Do you know Dr. John from the clinics?
Lee
Sorry.
Dorfman. They haven't. I mean,
no,
he's
wonderful.
certainly a fan. But
this is a fellow that the first time I met him, I was introduced to him. His after shaking hands said, "I wanted to talk to you about suppositories and formulating suppositories," but it was specifically for that. It was kind of
that's...
It was one of my most interesting personal introductions ever.
Okay.
Yeah.
Suppositories are really good for local conditions. So vaginal suppositories or rectal suppositories for a condition in those areas. However, the cannabinoids, particularly THC, are not well absorbed from the rectum. So suppositories are not a good way to treat a systemic illness.
Interesting.
Now, this has been shown in the lab, but additionally, one of the proofs of this experientially is, I hear this regularly. Someone has cancer. Someone's been nice enough to make cannabis-based suppositories for them with some huge amount of THC. The person takes it and they don't feel high. Sorry, but that's a guarantee that an inadequate dose was getting in. They're just not absorbed that way. So, again, for treating something in the area, great. Otherwise, it's a waste of medicine, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Speaking of a different physician friend that will go unnamed, this is before I had read some of the studies that you're talking about with the cannabis suppositories. I had gifted some to a friend of mine, a physician who was just starting to take an interest in cannabis medicine, and thankfully he tried it on a Friday evening because he was completely incapacitated for about 2 days afterwards. So I would say that sounds like he did get proper administration, but was basically bedridden for.
Well, like I said too earlier, everybody responds super differently.
Yeah, I mean, there could have been other factors we don't need to get into, but in this instance, something got in. But for most people, it doesn't.
Okay.
Well, speaking of getting it in, I appreciate you, again, making the time to come out and have a conversation with us today.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a pursuit of ours to get on, to get together and to get a little bit of your time. Just in really, like I said from the beginning, just wanted to express how thankful our organization is to the work that you've done, that you've put out into the public realm, that we've had access to, that inspired the ideas that led to the commercial endeavors that we do and the public education endeavors that we do. And we just look forward. One question, I didn't get a chance to ask that I think is good to round out with here is, you did Taming THC in 2011, and then I think it was end of 2017 you did Cannabis Pharmacology. Do you think you'll continue with that theme, doing the meta-analysis, and as more pertinent information comes out, do you see yourself doing another kind of similar paper in the future?
Actually, I hope not.
Oh.
But the reason is I really want to concentrate on producing primary research that's going to prove these concepts.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, that's going to be my focus from here going forward is proving the concepts that we've tried to present previously. I think that's going to be of greater utility. Hopefully there will be enough data to do a review paper at some future date, but I get a lot of invitations to write similar papers. I really don't want to, excuse the expression, rehash old ground, but rather go forward and present original research.
Yeah, who could blame you? So.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks again to the lodges at Vashon Island for having us out. Yeah, if you make the time to come out, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our thanks to you once again for tuning in. The Forest for the Trees is a production of True Terpenes, and the views expressed are solely those of the hosts and guests. Our thanks to Adrian Walther and Phantoms for the intro and outro music. You can find their work on Soundstripe, and you can find us here every other Friday with another conversation about the ever-changing world of cannabis. From all of us here at True Terpenes and the Forest for the Trees, be well and do great things.